the just desserts for the wealthy, the powerful, the crooked, the vote stealers, the plutocrats. The just desserts is that you sick Greg Palast on them. Now, Noam Chomsky said that Greg Palast upsets all the right people. And Noam Chomsky got that right, because Katherine Harris, the Secretary of State of Florida who stole the presidency, referred to him as twisted and maniacal. And Brittany is considered the most important investigative journalist that the BBC has. He has written best-selling books, The Best Democracy Money Can Buy and Armed Madhouse, but he is something else. He is the one reporter I know who, when he, not recently, but for years, has been saying, tell me what the banks are up to. Tell me what Wall Street is up to. This is the guy who saw the crash coming. This is the guy who saw the oil spills coming, because he doesn't listen to the politicians and the spin. He goes out and reports. Please welcome the greatest investigative journalist of our time, Greg Palast. Build him up to it.
Okay. All right. All right. We've already been to church with the Reverend. Thank you so much, John. They said we were going to have someone special as the last speaker, and I thought, wow, who's that? And I really want to thank John Nichols, who really is the best investigative reporter in America. Jim Hightower. Why does he always wear that hat, though? I don't understand. And the Reverend Jesse Jackson, the Reverend, you know, it was, I just realized it was like 35 years ago this month that Jesse Jackson and I spoke together. It was at a UAW hall for the unions, always for the unions, and I vowed that day, and I told the Reverend, I made a commitment that I will never, ever follow him on stage. There you go. And especially Ed Garvey. Let's give it up for Ed. Ed, you know, I gotta tell you, Ed Garvey challenges my atheism because there must be a higher benevolent power to have an Ed Garvey. And I don't mean Rahm Emanuel. In fact, when I don't know what to do, I always say WWED, what would Ed do? Now today is a very special and solemn day, as the Reverend told us. It is in Gainesville, Florida, Burn a Koran Day. Burn a Koran Day. Now, I worked in the World Trade Center, by the way. And my suggestion to the unreverend with his Burn the Koran Day is that it would have been a good idea if yesterday he had a Learn the Koran Day, because then he would have learned that the book he's about to burn has many lines in it where Muhammad discusses the holiness of a guy named Jesus of Nazareth. And that's what he's going to burn. Now, Reverend Jackson's been to divinity school, so he knows that professors of divinity call this being a schmuck. You know, we are. It's a day when we celebrate our tolerance versus bloody, murderous intolerance. And I know that there are some people holding tea bags who don't believe, and Mr. Beck, who don't believe that there should be a mosque near ground zero. Okay, it's upsetting. It's upsetting to have a mosque near ground zero. I work there, and I agree that maybe, and therefore, you know, Timmy McVeigh, a white supremacist, a terrorist who killed hundreds of people in Oklahoma City, and I would say it would be an insult to have white people in Oklahoma City. Now, if we're not going to have a mosque near Ground Zero, I don't think we should have any Muslims near Ground Zero, right? It's an insult. So what we could do is, how do you do this? Because I know the ADL was against the mosque near Ground Zero. So what I suggest is that the ADL hand out little yellow crescents to all the Muslims in New York so we can identify them and keep them away, right? Now, I worked there. They're rebuilding World Trade, the Freedom Tower. And they're going to make it just like we had it before, with the Victoria's Secret. It's the way we honor our dead. Victoria's Secret is that she was an Islamist. TGIF Fridays, Hugo Boss. So that's my solution. It's compromise. We disguise the mosque as a kind of, fashion center. Kate Mosque, or like one of those Disney stores, Mickey Mosque. No, I don't want a mosque near Ground Zero. I want it on top of Ground Zero. So when we go down next time, we're all going together. September 11th is a date that gave us, America, the Patriot Act. So we could charge terrorists who threaten our nation, like me. I was charged as a terrorist under the Patriot Act. I'm not kidding you. It's a long story, and I'm going to tell it. Now, meanwhile, I was in Las Vegas on April 20th, Hitler's birthday. I know it was April 20th, Hitler's birthday, because Mel Gibson was having a party in the casino. Oh, I made that up. Now, that's interesting. Mel Gibson is allowed to goose step into the new World Trade Center at Ground Zero. Okay. And I was in Vegas with a guy named Daniel Becknell, and I was there to talk about the destruction of the Gulf by oil. He's a Cajun lawyer who lives in the Delta. And when I was with him that evening, he got a call from the Coast Guard. They said that there was an explosion and that 11 of his clients, maybe a dozen of his clients, were in a capsule that they had recovered. See, on a rig, there's an emergency capsule. Something goes wrong where you can jump into it and it's fireproof and explosion-proof, and it blew right off the rig as it's supposed to do and float and save the workers. So they asked him, I was with him, the Coast Guard called and asked if they could open the capsule because there was no message from inside. They couldn't hear anyone inside, so they assumed everyone had simply been cooked alive, and they wanted to get his permission to open the capsule. Well, they weren't inside because they were vaporized. So I knew I had a new case, something else to investigate. And then I watched with Becknell, I watched on television as the oil spread. And I watched the emergency ships, and I watched and waited, and I didn't see them. I'm going to tell you something. Containing an oil spill from blowout, blowouts happen, ships run aground. It's not rocket science to contain this stuff. You see, you put that rubber stuff around it. It's called boom, all right? And then you take these ships and you suck the stuff out. They're called skimmers. Okay? So you boom and skimmers, and you need a crew to do it. There was no boom. There was no skimmers. There were no crews. The oil spread. And the President of the United States declared an emergency 5 days after it happened. That's interesting. If something's an emergency, why does it take you 5 days to figure it out? Okay? In the meantime, that had spread from a mile-wide slick to slick bigger than Jamaica, Mr. President. But when I'm watching this, I'm thinking, I've seen this movie before. I've seen this movie before. See, before I was a journalist, I had a real job, and I was an investigator. I was in charge of investigating fraud in the breakup of the Exxon Valdez and up in Alaska. Now, there the ship ran aground. The Exxon Valdez ran into a place called Bligh Island, named after, Captain Bligh, really. And now, what happened? See, on Bligh Island, there's supposed to be all that rubber stuff, that boom, right? And they were supposed to have a skimmer ship. But what happened was, the boom wasn't there. Because the oil companies, which had sworn to Congress that they would keep the sound clean, they had signed papers saying that the boom was right there on Bligh Island. In other words, the safety equipment was right where the ship hit, and they fulfilled that promise the cheap way. They just lied. They filled out papers saying it was there, and it wasn't. They also said that no tanker would move without a containment ship. The containment ship was locked under ice, immobile. And there were no crews. Why? I'm going to go back to something. Now, in 1969, the most valuable piece of property on this planet is Valdez Harbor, because it is absolutely the only place geologically in Alaska that you can terminate and load oil. It's an utterly invaluable property. And it was owned by the Chugach natives. And the natives were paid for the most valuable property on the face of this earth, $1. That's less than they got for Manhattan. They're paid $1, but they're also promised jobs. And they said, for America, we will give up this land, but we need work. And they were given the jobs, being the oil spill response crews. When that ship ran aground, the natives, the Chugach natives on Titlik Island actually came out and watched it. Chief Komkoff told me he was watching the ship come in towards their village, and it hit the reef. And they could do nothing about it. Because the company that had bought their land for $1, the company that had promised them jobs, the company that promised to put the boom out in case there was a danger, the company that was in charge of having the containment ship, and they didn't even have a man on it or a piece of equipment. The company known as British Petroleum had fired all the natives and didn't tell the government that there would be no emergency crews, so they watched helpless as the ship hit the reef and covered their island and their village with oil and ended 3,000 years of the Chugach way of life. So the name on the ship was Exxon, but the name on the destruction was BP. And that they didn't tell you because they did it again and again and again. And between Alaska and the Gulf was Colombia, but you don't get that in your news. Between Alaska and the Gulf was Nigeria and Liberia. I've been down there. You can still see the goop. In fact, you can go up to Sleepy Bay in Alaska, stick your hand under the gravel, pull it up, and it's covered with crude. Excuse me, Secretary Salazar, he says it's all gone. In the Gulf, it hasn't been 20 weeks. 20 years, it's still there in Alaska, Mr. Secretary. Now, did they know? Were there warnings? Yeah. There was a guy, Chuck Hamill, who was actually a partner of British Petroleum. And he had part of the lease with them for the oil. And he went to Valdez, being an expert, and he said, holy crap, what if we have a tanker spill? My God, things are going to, we're not prepared. So he was worried about the liability. He was so worried that he actually took a Concorde to London. He took the first Concorde to London, ran to the British Petroleum offices, talked to the chairman, and said, we've got danger in Valdez. And they said, they took that right down, they took down his name, and then they hired a group of ex-CIA operatives to follow him. And then he went to a congressman in Washington, Congressman Mitchell. They tapped his phone. They went through his garbage. They broke into his house. But then when he met with the congressman, they wanted to listen in on the conversation. So they took one of those little toy trucks, you know, with the little that your kids have with the little radio thing, and they ran it through the hotel vents with a microphone. Unfortunately, for British Petroleum and its black ops people, the FBI was also in that hotel, and they had run wires through the vents because they were staking out some mobsters. And someone at the FBI who's listening in and watching the monitors is saying, "Oh my God, there's another bug in here." And they thought it was the mobsters trying to, you know, find out what the FBI is doing. So they kicked in the door. They figured out where the bug was coming from. They kicked in the door, and there were the BP guys. And they got busted. And a federal, really, it's like, it's oil's Watergate, and they went before a judge. And the judge said that British Petroleum's action was reminiscent of Nazi Germany. That's a quote from the judge. So they did the right thing. They painted their gas stations green. Kind of a pukey, dead leprechaun green. Now, wait a minute. As I told you, I was with Becknell talking about destruction of the Gulf by oil in the morning of the 20th. We didn't get the word till the evening, that spill. Why? So what's going on here? So if you were taking notes, you're seeing a discrepancy, maybe. Well, the answer is the Gulf was already destroyed. Already destroyed by these guys. And who did it? Now, I told you that the real damaging company in Alaska was British Petroleum. When you see those scenes of the birds dipped in oil and the you know, the horrible residue all over the beaches is Grand Isle, that's not BP. You could have done that the week before the spill. Grand Isle is always a crap hole. Sorry. But why? Okay, because Louisiana's been an oil colony for quite a long time. Okay? Here's what's happened. We're talking about the destruction of the Gulf Coast and the Mississippi Delta. Let me give you a number. Shell oil has dredged 8.8 million cubic yards, removed it of the Delta land. Okay? Just for its pipes, 22,624 acres of the Delta was removed just by Shell. More by BP and even more by Chevron. So what? You know, we use the term wetlands, we mean swamp. You know? So it's a swamp. They got rid of swamp. So what? Bottom line, and I'm quoting an expert, the bottom line is 2,000 people are dead. Here's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about New Orleans and Katrina. There was just a court case on the causes. There was a suit by the people of New Orleans to seek recovery and find out the cause of the destruction. And one of the causes was that if there had been 6 more miles of swamp wetlands protection, the surge of water could have not reached New Orleans. What Chevron took away came back into the city. Now, there was a lawsuit. Okay. So how did this happen? Okay. Not only did the oil companies remove the swampland, but they didn't like the idea that they had to take their oil tankers all around the lazy Mississippi the way the Lord made the Delta. That's expensive and long and difficult. They said, what if you took an arrow and just rammed through from the Gulf up to New Orleans a straight line canal. Just make a ditch. And there is something called Mr. Go, the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet, which the Army Corps built at the oil company's insistence, which is just a gun barrel facing right into New Orleans. And you know what the engineers call that? They called it the Hurricane Highway. And they were just waiting. I could read you the engineering reports saying what would happen if a major storm, not even a hurricane, came up in that direction. It was the path taken by Katrina. Katrina never hit New Orleans, never touched New Orleans. It went east of the city. But there, the Hurricane Highway took the water from the Gulf and it surged up. Now a shorter distance because there wasn't the delta when that the Lord had made. It surged up and it knocked overtopped the levees and undercut them. And that's what happened. It was not, as George Bush claimed and his Justice Department claimed in court, an act of God. Don't blame God, Mr. Bush. It was an act of Chevron. It was an act of Shell. It was an act of BP, and they're complicit with the Army Corps of Engineers, which is, by the way, has nothing to do with Army, and it's not a corps. It's basically contractors like Shaw. If you read Confessions of an Economic Hitman, that's the company. Now, there was a court case brought by the people of New Orleans, a class action. Becknell was one of the people on it. Class action to recover. Now, why? How could they do that? The answer is that when federal levees, federal seawalls, broke in Long Island, New York, and West Hampton Dunes, the federal government said it was a federal seawall, so we must rebuild all the houses. Each house was $3 million, 170 houses, $3 million apiece from the subprime loan sharks, the real estate agents, and the rest of that crowd. And just so they wouldn't get their beach towels wet, the federal government trucked in 1,000 truckloads of sand to remake their beach. What did they do in New Orleans? They said it was not that the levees did not fail. Now, you saw it on TV. They're telling you what you saw didn't happen, right? Now, how did I get busted? I was going up. It's all part of the story. It's getting there. It's getting there. See, just now you keep kind of put the pieces together. I was driving up, doing an investigation for a show called Democracy Now! And, yeah. I usually do BBC, but this was Democracy Now! We went up to Baton Rouge to talk to the head of the Hurricane Center, the deputy head of the Hurricane Center at Louisiana State University, a guy named Dr. Ivor Von Heerden. I want you to remember that name because giants walk this earth. He is one. Now, Von Heerden, no one had been talking to this guy, but I figured I want to find out what happened with Katrina. He's the expert. Here's Mr. Hurricane. So I said, what happens? And he started, you have to understand, he was actually beginning to tremble. You could see that he had something on his mind. I kept the camera rolling and just kept tell me what happened. And I kept asking questions. And what he said was, on Monday night, and I'm quoting, the White House knew, but we didn't know. He was with the governor. He was running the hurricane evacuation operation with the governor. The White House knew, but we didn't know that the levees were breaking apart. We knew that the hurricane had missed the city, but the White House knew that it had already was about to destroy the city. They didn't tell the state, because to tell the state would be to admit that the federal government now had responsibility. So they didn't tell the state. The evacuation had stopped, and the levees broke apart, and at least 2,000 people washed away. He said that was the effect. And he said, before that, that he'd called the White House saying that there was a danger, given what's happened in the wetlands, that New Orleans would drown unless the Army Corps fixed the levees to withstand this new onslaught that they had created themselves. He said he called the White House not a week before Katrina, 2 years before. Now, 2 years before. But what happened? What happened was, when I ran the story, is Von Heerden lost his job, right? Another toy truck operation. But I asked Louisiana State, what do you mean he didn't, why'd you fire this guy? Why'd you fire this guy? Well, he committed another sin. They complained that he had acted without authority. Acting without authority meant that he was about to testify as an expert in the case against the federal government and the oil companies about the Mr. Go Canal. And they told him, you testify, we'll fire you. But when the heat went on, they didn't fire him. He was head of the Hurricane Center, so they just eliminated the Hurricane Center. This is Louisiana. They eliminated the Hurricane Center just to get rid of this guy, Dr. Von Heerden, right? Well, they said, don't worry. I asked them, how could you eliminate the Hurricane Center? They said, even better, we're building a wetland center with a whole new staff. We're going to protect the wetlands. Sounds great. But it was odd because all the experts in their wetland center kept saying how they wanted to protect the herons and the alligators and the mangroves and the oil rigs. It was a little odd. I said, well, wait a minute. This is a very odd wetlands protection center. Who's funding this? And they said, well, an environmental group called America's Wetlands. So I looked into America's Wetlands. And sure enough, 100% of America's wetlands money came from Chevron and British Petroleum. You're shocked. And so how did I get busted? Well, I can tell you this. I got busted because Exxon complained to the Department of Homeland Security. They're the ones that filed the complaint. I was obviously a terrorist. How do they know that? I had, on my way back down from speaking with Dr. Von Heerden, decided to stop in at the refugee center for Katrina victims, our Guantanamo on wheels, which they called Renaissance Village. In the middle of nowhere. They had one bus a week to get out of there, which took you to the Walmart and back. Kid you not. And I took from Renaissance Village the pictures of the Exxon refinery, because people were breathing in. This was a place known as Toxic Alley, and that's where we put the victims of Katrina. And what happened was, so they filed a complaint saying that I was photographing their refinery. Well, I said we couldn't photograph BP's refinery. It had blown up and killed 25 workers. There's nothing left, right? So we filmed Exxon showing that one. And so after a couple of weeks, Homeland Security tracked us down, me and my producer, Matt Pascarella, and said charges had been filed. Could we turn ourselves in? And I said, you're joking. And they said, you know, it's no joke. A lot of people died on September 11th. And I said, I know, I worked there. A lot of people did die. Why don't you go and find the people that killed them? Well, I wouldn't count on it, because think of this. It took them, Homeland Security, 2 weeks to find Greg Palast. And I'm on television! But here's the mystery. Here's the mystery. The judge in the Mr. Go case ruled that the wetlands were destroyed. If it hadn't been destroyed, New Orleans wouldn't have drowned. And the drowning of New Orleans was made certain by the federal government's Mr. Go canal. He said it was absolutely certain, and he ordered the federal government just a couple months ago to pay to restore all the homes of New Orleans. But if you remember, it was George Bush who said, it's not our responsibility. It's God. Send him the bill, right? But then a new guy took over the Justice Department, Mr. Holder, and his boss, Mr. Obama. And they have said that they will now appeal that decision. That they still believe that the bill should go to God and not, they had a choice. They could have appealed the decision, or they could have sued the oil companies for their share. But they chose not to. Now, what I don't understand, someone explained to me. The Reverend was saying, why are we in Afghanistan? I don't know why Barack Obama took on George Bush's war in Afghanistan. And I absolutely don't know why he took on George Bush's war against the people of New Orleans. By the way, I'm not in the yellow suit in Guantanamo, you notice. We screened. And that's the point. We screened. And so I'm not in prison. I mean, some of you may think that that's not quite a great advantage. But what I have to say is, what are we going to do about it? I'm not talking about what are we going to do about that lawsuit. What are we going to do about all of it? Afghanistan, the war on New Orleans, the war on homeowners, the war on sensibility and tolerance. Well, this is the Fighting Bob Fest. It's not the Napping Bob Fest. This is about fighting. Fighting. And what we need is a weapon. Okay? And the weapon is the information. You know, John Pilger, when I was doing this work, said to me, he's a great British journalist, and Pilger said to me, Greg, this information is a hand grenade. But it's a different hand grenade. See, the truth isn't something that blows things apart, Mr. Beck. The truth is something that puts things together. Okay? So let's get together real soon. Once a year is not enough. You're not going to win my affection once a year. That's just not. Let's keep meeting. One place to meet is electronically at gregpalast.com. No charge. We get the information when we talk to each other. We stay informed. We put together our little truth grenades. That's the beginning. And if you want, by the way, my not-for-profit foundation that supports journalism that annoys all the right people, we are selling the BBC broadcasts to raise money for the foundation out there. I'll sign them all. I'll talk to you all. Give me your cards. Give me your names. I want them. Give me your. I mean it. You know? Yeah, I know 2,000. That's fine. That's a start. Okay. But here's what I want you to do. So we're fighting, not napping. Because when you go up to heaven, I won't be there, but when you go, I want you to give a message to Bob LaFollette for me. And I want you to say, when he asks you, what are you doing? And you can say, with Ed Garvey, we're still fighting, Bob. We're still fighting. Thank you. And good night.